Open the gun safe of any hunter over 50, and you'll likely find one rifle that they just don't make like that anymore. A genuine Marlin lever action. Maybe a 3.36 in point, 30-30, maybe a 3.9, 8.22. The bluing is worn thin at the muzzle. The walnut stock is dark and smooth from decades of use. That side ejection port still catches the light the same way it did back in the New Haven factory. This rifle survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and generations of hard use. It outlived almost everything until it faced the corporate boardrooms of our own time. What happened to America's great lever action legend? That's the story. As we uncover the full story of its dramatic rise and fiery fall, I want to hear from you. Which legendary company or forgotten factory should we investigate next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you love these stories of industrial empires, brilliant innovations, and the fateful decisions that changed history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming. The story of Marlin Firearms begins with a young man who learned his trade inside the company that would become his shadow for the next 50 years. John Marlin was born in Windsor Locks, Connecticut in 1836, the son of a New England farming family that produced no gunsmiths and held no particular interest in the manufacture of weapons. At 18, he apprenticed at the Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company in Hartford, the largest and most advanced firearms factory in the United States. He spent his apprenticeship years on the floor of an operation that defined American gun making. He filed lock plates by hand. He fitted ejector mechanisms to revolver frames machined to tolerances measured in fractions no untrained eye could see. The Civil War came in 1861. Colt's plant in Hartford ran day and night, producing the revolvers that armed Union officers, cavalry troopers, and naval landing parties. Marlin worked through the war years inside the largest weapons factory in the Union, watching how a real industrial operation handled wartime demand. He saw the discipline. He saw the machinery. He also saw what an apprentice at Colt could never become: a man without family connections, without capital, without political reach inside the company, would spend his entire career fitting parts at someone else's bench. Marlin was good at what he did. He was not so good that the Colt brothers were going to make him a partner. He left in 1863 and opened a small shop on State Street in New Haven. The choice of city was not accidental. New Haven was already the second great center of American gun-making, sitting across the state from Hartford and competing with it in everything. Winchester Repeating Arms Company operated within a mile of where Marlin set up his bench. Whitney Arms Company, founded by Eli Whitney's son to continue the family's musket contracts, ran a factory in the Whitneyville district just north of town. Sharp's Rifle Manufacturing Company had a plant on the same side of the harbor. Picture this: a city of barely 40,000 people, and inside its boundaries sat 4 firearms factories competing for federal contracts, civilian sales, and the same pool of skilled labor. Marlin made Derringers, small single-shot pistols designed for civilian self-defense, easily concealed in a coat pocket or a lady's handbag. They were the weapons of riverboat gamblers, Pinkerton agents, and prostitutes who worked the saloons west of the Mississippi. The Civil War officer trade ended when the war ended, but the post-war Derringer market was enormous. Every man with money who traveled west wanted one. Every man with money who stayed east wanted one for his wife. Marlin filed the parts himself in those early years, often working at his bench late into the evening after the 2 or 3 men he employed had gone home. The pistols sold, the shop expanded. By 1870, the operation was large enough to require a proper factory. Marlin moved to a building on Orange Street in New Haven and began calling the business the J.M. Marlin Firearms Company. He hired more men. He took on the production of small revolvers, in addition to the Derringers, putting his single-shot designs against the cheap pocket pistols flooding the market from Hopkins and Allen, from Hood Firearms, from a dozen small workshops that had sprung up across New England in the post-war boom. Marlin's revolvers were not the best on the market. They were not the cheapest either. They were, however, well made. A Marlin pistol from this period had parts that fit, springs that held their temper, and a finish that did not flake within a year of purchase. Here's the thing about the New Haven gun-making ecosystem in the 1870s. Every gunsmith dreamed of being Winchester. Winchester sat at the top of the city's industrial hierarchy, employed more men, paid better wages, ran more advanced machinery, and held the patents that mattered. Oliver Winchester had taken over the bankrupt Volcanic Repeating Arms Company in 1857, renamed it New Haven Arms, then renamed it again to Winchester Repeating Arms in 1866, and by the early 1870s was producing the model 1866 lever-action rifle that had defined the post-war civilian market. Winchester had eaten Volcanic. Winchester had eaten New Haven Arms. Winchester was eating every small competitor in town through superior capital, superior machinery, and patents that locked rivals out of the lever-action market. Marlin made a strategic decision that would define his company for the next century. He would not try to outproduce Winchester. He could not. Winchester had 10 times his capital, 20 times his floor space, and a marketing operation that placed its rifles in every general store from the Mississippi to the Pacific. What Marlin could do, what he believed any disciplined Connecticut craftsman could do, was outdesign Winchester. A smaller shop could move faster. A smaller shop could try variations a large operation would never authorize. A smaller shop, run by a man who actually understood the metallurgy of a barrel and the geometry of a lock, could build a rifle that did things a Winchester could not. The conviction was sound. The flaw underneath it was financial. Marlin operated on capital generated entirely by current sales. He had no outside investors. He had no military contracts of consequence. The Ordnance Department of the United States Army had its preferred suppliers, and Marlin was not on the list. Whenever he needed to expand the factory, he expanded it with money earned the previous year. Whenever he needed to retool for a new product, he retooled with money the next product had not yet generated. This pattern, established in the 1870s, would haunt the company through every subsequent crisis. Marlin Firearms had no margin of error. One bad year would not bankrupt it. 2 bad years might. The 1870s were good years. The American economy expanded, the western frontier kept moving, and the civilian demand for firearms ran at levels the country had never seen. Marlin produced a series of single-shot rifles to compete in the cheap utility market. He produced the Ballard rifle line, acquired through the purchase of patent rights from a Massachusetts inventor named Charles H. Ballard, and the Ballards developed a reputation among target shooters and varmint hunters that Marlin had not enjoyed previously. By 1875, the company employed roughly 60 men. By 1879, the number was closer to 100. The product line had grown beyond pistols into rifles, and the rifles were beginning to find buyers across the United States and into Canada. But the lever action was the dream. The lever action was where Winchester lived. The lever action was the rifle every man on the Western Plains carried, the rifle every general store stocked, the rifle that defined the American firearm of the late 19th century. Marlin knew that if his company was going to compete with Winchester for a place in American gun-making history, it would have to compete on Winchester's chosen ground. It would have to build a lever action. And in 1881, in a factory still funded entirely by the previous year's revenue, with patents licensed from outside designers and machinery purchased on credit, John Malin Marlin prepared to do exactly that. The man who designed Marlin's first lever-action rifle was not John Malin Marlin. He was an itinerant gun designer from upstate New York named Andrew Burgess. and his relationship with the firearms industry of the 1880s was the relationship of a brilliant outsider to an industry that did not quite know what to do with him. Burgess held more firearms patents than any American inventor of his generation outside of Hiram Maxim. He had designed rifles for Whitney Arms, for Colt, for the Burgess Gun Company that briefly bore his own name. He sold his designs the way a novelist sells manuscripts. Whoever paid got the rifle. Whoever paid the most got the best one. Marlin paid for the Burgess design in 1881. The Model 1881 was a tube magazine lever action chambered for the heavy black powder cartridges that defined American big game hunting in the late 19th century. It fired the .45-70 Government, the .45-85, the .40-60, the cartridges that dropped buffalo and grizzly bears on the western plains. The Winchester Model 1876, the closest competitor, fired similar rounds, but lacked the toggle-link action strength that Burgess had engineered into the Marlin. Hunters who shot heavy loads at heavy game began to notice. The Model 1881 was not a runaway success. It sold steadily for a decade. It established Marlin as a maker of serious rifles for serious shooters, not a producer of pocket pistols and target single shots. Marlin followed the 1881 with the Model 1888, a smaller frame lever action chambered for the .32-20, .38-40, and .44-40 cartridges that defined the medium game and pistol caliber market. The 1888 was designed by Lewis Lobdell Hepburn, and Hepburn's arrival at Marlin Firearms in the spring of 1888 was the event that changed the company permanently. Hepburn came from Remington. He had spent 20 years there as the company's chief designer, responsible for the rolling block single-shot rifles that armed half the world's militaries through the 1870s and into the 1880s. Remington had gone bankrupt in 1886, restructured, and emerged with reduced ambitions. Hepburn left the new Remington in 1888 and walked to Marlin's New Haven factory looking for work. He was 52 years old. He had patents in his pocket that no other firearms company would let him exploit. Marlin hired him within a week. What Hepburn did at Marlin over the next decade rewrote what the company was capable of producing. He came in not as a hired designer, but as a chief engineer, with authority over the entire technical operation. And he used that authority to redesign the Marlin action from first principles. The Model 1881 and the 1888 had used tube magazine actions that loaded cartridges through a side gate and ejected them through an open-top receiver. This was the Winchester pattern. Every American lever action of the era used some variant of it. The problem with the Winchester pattern was that the receiver had to be open on top to let the spent cartridge case fly out, which meant the receiver could not be made into a solid, one-piece structure, which meant the rifle could not easily be fitted with a telescopic sight or a peep sight, and which meant rainwater, dust, and powder fouling fell directly into the action every time the lever was worked. Hepburn solved all of these problems with a single design decision. He moved the ejection port from the top of the receiver to the side. The Model 1889, his first design for Marlin, ejected its spent cartridge cases out the right-hand side of the receiver, leaving the top of the receiver completely solid. A scope could now be mounted directly above the bore. A peep sight could be installed without obstruction. Rain stayed out. Dust stayed out. The action ran cleaner and stayed cleaner. Here's the thing about side ejection. It was not a small improvement. It was the technical declaration of independence that separated Marlin from Winchester for the next century and a half. Winchester could not adopt side ejection without violating Hepburn's patents. Winchester also could not abandon the top eject design, because the top eject was the Winchester pattern that every Winchester customer recognized. Hepburn had placed his employer on ground that the larger competitor could not occupy. Marlin would forever after be the lever action you fitted a scope to, Winchester would forever after be the lever action you did not. The Model 1889 was the first production rifle to use the new system. It was followed by the Model 1891 in .22 rimfire, by the Model 1892 in pistol calibers, by the Model 1893 in centerfire smokeless powder cartridges suitable for the new generation of military and hunting rounds. Each rifle refined the design further. The Model 1893 in particular introduced a two-piece firing pin that prevented accidental discharge if the lever was not fully closed, a feature so obviously correct that every subsequent lever-action manufacturer adopted some version of it. Hepburn was working harder than any chief engineer in American firearms history. He filed 22 patents during his time at Marlin. He redesigned the company's manufacturing processes to match the new actions, specifying new milling machines, new gauges, new heat treatment furnaces. He trained the New Haven workforce in the techniques his designs required. The Connecticut craftsmen who had been fitting Marlin parts by hand for a decade now learned to operate machinery that produced parts to tighter tolerances than hand fitting could achieve. Some of the older armorers resisted. Most adapted. A few left for Winchester or Whitney rather than learn the new methods, and Hepburn let them go without protest. The 1890s were the decade in which Marlin became Marlin. The product line stabilized around the side eject lever actions, the single-shot rifles, and a line of shotguns designed to compete with the Remington and Stevens patterns. The workforce grew from roughly 150 men in 1890 to over 300 by 1895. The factory on Orange Street had been outgrown years earlier. Marlin had moved to a larger plant on Willow Street and was already planning a further expansion. The company was profitable. The company was technically respected. The company was, for the first time in its existence, something Winchester could not ignore. Hepburn's strategic position inside the company was complicated. He was not a partner. He held no equity. He was paid a salary plus royalties on his patents, and the royalty arrangement made him a wealthy man by the standards of New Haven gun trade engineering, but he served at John Mullen Marlin's pleasure. The relationship between the two men was professional rather than warm. Marlin respected Hepburn's work and paid him well for it. Hepburn respected Marlin's business judgment and did not interfere with it. They did not socialize. They did not, as far as the surviving records suggest, particularly like each other. What they shared was a conviction that the Marlin Firearms Company was building something that mattered, and a willingness to spend the back half of their working lives building it together. Picture this, a New Haven factory in 1894, 300 men working 2 shifts, the sound of milling machines cutting receiver blanks from forged steel, the rattle of drop hammers in the forging shop, the smell of cutting oil and gun bluing and tobacco smoke from the men who worked their pipes between operations. The Marlin rifles coming off the assembly line carried a stamp that read Marlin Firearms Company, New Haven, Connecticut, USA, and they carried features no Winchester could match: side ejection, solid top receivers, 2-piece firing pins, patent dates running back to the late 1880s, each one a small territorial claim that Hepburn had staked against the larger competitor across town. The models 1893, 1894, and 1895 were the rifles that armed the closing American frontier. Each was a Hepburn design built around the side eject principle, each chambered for a different class of cartridge, and each sold into a different segment of the American shooting market. The Model 1893 fired the new smokeless powder cartridges that the military had begun adopting at the start of the decade. The Model 1894 fired the .25-20, .32-20, .38-40, and .44-40 pistol caliber rounds that frontier farmers and lawmen wanted in a rifle that could chamber the same ammunition as their revolvers. The Model 1895 was the heavyweight, chambered for the .45-70, the .40-65, the .33 Winchester, the cartridges that put down elk and moose, and the last grizzly bears in the lower 48. The frontier was closing as these rifles came off the New Haven line. The Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed in 1890. The buffalo herds were gone. The Indian wars were ending. The great cattle drives were giving way to fenced ranches and barbed wire. But the men who had lived on the frontier did not vanish with it. They became homesteaders in Wyoming and Montana, ranchers in New Mexico, sheriffs in Arizona, prospectors in the Black Hills, guides in the Rocky Mountains. They needed rifles. They bought Marlins by the tens of thousands. The named users of these rifles built the company's reputation. Charles Daly, a New York gun dealer, wrote that the Marlin Model 1893 was the finest production rifle of its caliber on the American market. Theodore Roosevelt, who later carried Winchesters on his African safari, owned a Marlin Model 1895 in .45-70 during his Dakota ranching years and recommended it to other big-game hunters. Annie Oakley, the most famous exhibition shooter in America, performed with Marlin rifles for years on the Buffalo Bill Wild West tour. Oakley was paid by no one to use Marlin's rifles. She used them because she preferred them. Her endorsement could not be bought, which made it worth more than any endorsement that could. Western lawmen bought Marlins because the side eject design worked with the new telescopic sights that were beginning to appear in the late 1890s. A peace officer pursuing rustlers at long range across open country could mount a Stevens or a Malcolm scope directly above the receiver of a Marlin in a way that no Winchester would allow. Big game outfitters in Colorado and Wyoming bought Marlins for the same reason. The customer base was not as large as Winchester's. It did not have to be. Marlin had carved out the segment of the lever-action market where customers wanted features Winchester could not offer, and the company served that segment with rifles built to a standard the larger competitor could not undercut on price without losing money on every unit. Picture this: the Willow Street factory in 1895, 350 men working through a hot July afternoon. The ground floor housed the forging shop, where drop hammers shaped barrel blanks and receiver forgings from steel billets heated to a working temperature in coke-fired furnaces. The second floor housed the machine shop, rows of milling machines and lathes driven by overhead leather belts running off line shafts, powered by a single coreless steam engine in the basement. The third floor was the assembly and finishing floor, where rifles were fitted together, test-fired in a basement range whose ventilation never quite kept up with the powder smoke, and polished for bluing in tanks of hot caustic salts. The men on the floor were Connecticut Yankee craftsmen working alongside Irish and German immigrants who had come to New Haven for the steady wages and stayed for the Union of Trades. They worked piece rate. Deutsch Street, paid by the finished component rather than by the hour, which gave them control over their own pace within the constraints of the assembly schedule. A skilled fitter could complete his day's quota by mid-afternoon and earn the same wage as a slower man working until 6. The fast man went home early or worked overtime on a different component for additional pay. The slow man took the full day, drew his standard wage, and was kept on the payroll as long as his quality stayed acceptable. The culture was disciplined in a way the older Harper's Ferry armorers would not have recognized. There was no whiskey on the factory floor. There was no clock fighting. The Marlin workforce had been recruited and trained by Hepburn under conditions that did not tolerate the artisan independence traditions of the federal armories. A man who came late twice was warned. A man who came late 3 times was dismissed. The piece rate system rewarded productivity. The discipline system enforced reliability. Connecticut Yankee craft meant something specific in this context. It meant a man who could fit a Marlin receiver to tolerances of 0.02 of an inch, who showed up sober at the 7 o'clock whistle, and who took his work seriously enough that he never had to be told twice. Here's the thing about Marlin's marketing in this period. The company refused to compete with Winchester on advertising spend. Winchester ran full-page advertisements in every sporting magazine. paid for endorsements from celebrity hunters, and maintained a network of regional sales representatives who covered the country from a permanent office in New Haven. Marlin did none of these things. The company's advertising budget was a fraction of Winchester's. The Marlin sales operation consisted of John Marlin himself and a small clerical staff who handled correspondence and shipping. The rifles sold through general stores and gun dealers who ordered them by mail. The catalog was sent on request to customers who wrote in. The decision was not negligence. It was conviction. Marlin believed that engineering would sell rifles to the shooters who understood engineering, and that the shooters who understood engineering were the customers worth having. Volume customers who chose a rifle on the basis of magazine advertisements would buy Winchesters, and the price Marlin would have to pay to win those customers exceeded what the segment could justify. The strategy worked because the segment was real. Serious American hunters and shooters did notice the side eject, and the solid top receiver, and the two-piece firing pin, and they did buy Marlins, and they did tell other serious hunters to do the same. The company sold what it could produce. The production rate constrained sales, not the demand. By 1900, the operation had outgrown the Willow Street plant. Marlin announced a relocation to a new, larger facility on State Street in the northern district of New Haven, a brick mill that would house the entire operation under one roof for the first time. The new factory ran 400 men by 1901, with capacity for further expansion as demand warranted. The product line had stabilized around the lever-action rifles, a series of single-shot target rifles based on the Ballard patents, and the shotgun line that competed with Remington and Stevens. The company was profitable. The company was respected. The company was, by every measurable standard, at the high point of its founder's career. John Marlin reorganized the business as a stock corporation in 1900 and renamed it the Marlin Firearms Company. The reorganization was a routine legal step that consolidated the various Marlin operations under a single corporate structure and prepared the company for the eventual transfer of ownership to his sons. Marlin was 64 years old. He had built the company from a one-room workshop into a manufacturer that employed 400 men and produced rifles that hunters across America preferred to Winchesters. He intended to step back from daily operations and let his sons Marlin Henry Marlin and John Howard Marlin assume management responsibilities while he remained as president in a strategic role. He died the following year. John Marlin contracted pneumonia in the late spring of 1901 and was dead within 2 weeks. He was 65 years old. The company he had founded 38 years earlier passed to his two sons by the terms of his will, with both men holding equal shares and equal authority. Let that sink in. The man who had walked away from Colt's Hartford bench in 1863 to open a one-room shop in New Haven left behind a corporation that employed 400 men, produced the rifles that armed the American frontier, and had defeated Winchester on technical ground that the larger competitor could not occupy. The artisan era of Marlin Firearms ended with him. What came next would be run by men who had inherited the company rather than built it. Marlin Henry Marlin and John Howard Marlin took over the company in the summer of 1901. Neither brother had inherited their father's instinct for the gun trade. Marlin Henry was the elder, a competent businessman who had worked in the company's administrative offices for over a decade and understood the books well enough to keep them. John Howard was younger, more interested in society and politics than in the technical side of firearms manufacturing, and his contributions to the company's operations were largely ceremonial. Hepburn continued to run the design department until his death in 1914, which meant the products kept improving for a decade after the founder died. Everything that was technically superior about Marlin Firearms in the years between 1901 and 1915 traced back to designs Hepburn had already completed or was completing in those years. The financial side was a different story. The Marlin brothers did not understand the capital requirements of a firearms manufacturer competing against Winchester and the newly resurgent Remington. They paid themselves substantial salaries from company earnings. They drew dividends in years when retained earnings should have funded new machinery. They allowed the operation to coast on the products their father and Hepburn had developed, without funding the next generation of designs that would have kept Marlin competitive into the 1920s. The Model 1897 lever action in .22 rimfire was introduced in 1897 under the founder's direction. It became the basis of the Model 39A that would define the company in the post-war era. The Model 1898 shotgun followed. The Model 1903 was a slide-action rifle in .22 caliber that competed with the Winchester Model 1890 and the Remington Model 12. The Model 1907 was a slide-action shotgun. None of these designs were as significant as the side-eject lever actions that had built the company's reputation in the 1890s. The brothers were managing a product line they had not designed, sold by a sales operation they had not built, in a market that was changing faster than they were prepared to follow. By 1914, the company was in trouble. Hepburn was dead. The Marlin brothers were running an operation that had not introduced a major new design in over a decade. Working capital was thin. The European war that had broken out in August was already beginning to absorb American industrial capacity into munitions contracts that small firearms manufacturers could not easily access. The brothers needed money. They needed it quickly, and they needed it in larger quantities than the family's existing capital base could supply. In the summer of 1915, the Marlin brothers sold the company to a syndicate organized by a New York investor named Albert F. Rockwell. Rockwell paid roughly $2 million for the controlling interest. The transaction was structured as the sale of the family's stock holdings to a new corporate entity, which would be renamed the Marlin Rockwell Corporation. The Marlin name remained on the rifles. The Marlin family did not. Rockwell was not a gunmaker. He was a financier who had identified an opportunity that the Marlin brothers had failed to see. The European war was generating demand for automatic weapons at a scale that no peacetime industry could absorb. The British, French, and Russian governments were buying every machine gun American industry could produce, and they were paying premium prices for delivery within months rather than years. A firearms factory that could be retooled for machine gun production stood to make extraordinary profits during the war and emerge with industrial capacity that no peacetime competitor could match. The Marlin Rockwell Corporation pursued this strategy with the discipline of a financial operation rather than the conservatism of a gun-making family. Within 6 months of the acquisition, the New Haven factory had been retooled to manufacture the Colt Browning M1895 machine gun under license. The heavy belt-fed water-cooled weapon that had armed American forces during the Spanish-American War, and that the British and French armies were now buying in quantities Colt's Hartford plant could not satisfy alone. Marlin Rockwell also began producing components for the Lewis light machine gun, an aircraft-mounted weapon used extensively by the Royal Flying Corps and later by the United States Army Air Service. By 1917, the company had won contracts for the M1917 Marlin tank machine gun, a heavily modified Colt Browning designed specifically for installation in the new American tank designs. The Marlin tank gun fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the standard infantry rifle, used a gas-operated rather than recoil-operated action, and was light enough to be mounted in the sponsons of the small French Renault FT tanks that the American Expeditionary Forces would receive in 1918. Marlin Rockwell also produced the Marlin aircraft machine gun, a variant designed for synchronization with the propellers of pursuit aircraft. Picture this: the New Haven factory in the autumn of 1917, running 3 shifts around the clock, employing nearly 3,000 workers, producing machine guns at a rate the Marlin family could never have imagined. The lever-action rifle line had been shut down. The shotgun production had been suspended. Every machine tool in the plant had been retooled for some component of the military contracts. The forging shop ran red-hot through 3 8-hour shifts. The assembly floors were lit by electric arc lamps so that work could continue after sunset. The men on the lines were paid wartime wages, double or triple what they had earned, producing sporting rifles in 1914. They worked 6 days a week. They worked through Sunday when contract deadlines required it. They produced machine guns at a rate of several hundred per week. The money was extraordinary. Marlin Rockwell paid dividends through 1916, 1917, and 1918 that exceeded the entire profit history of the original Marlin Firearms Company. The corporation's stock price climbed steadily through the war years. Rockwell himself was wealthier in 1918 than he had been when he organized the syndicate 3 years earlier, and the other syndicate members had recovered their investment several times over. The strategy had worked exactly as intended. The Marlin name was attached to the most successful munitions contract of the war, and the corporate entity that owned that name was generating profits at a scale the firearms industry had never previously produced. Then, on November 11, 1918, the war ended. The armistice was signed in a railway car in the Compiègne forest at 5 in the morning. The fighting on the Western Front ceased at 11. By the close of business that day, the War Department had notified every munitions contractor in the United States that their contracts were being canceled, effective immediately. Marlin Rockwell received a telegram informing the corporation that no further machine guns would be accepted, that all in-process work should be halted, that final payment for completed deliveries would be settled within 90 days, and that the company should make no further plans for military production. Here's the thing about contract cancellation in 1918. There was no transition period. There was no scheduled wind-down. The contracts ended on the day the armistice was signed, and the factories that depended on those contracts were left with raw materials, work in progress, and finished components for which no buyer existed. Marlin Rockwell had invested heavily in tooling specific to the M1917 tank gun and the aircraft machine guns. None of that tooling could be repurposed for civilian production. The lever-action rifle machinery had been disassembled and sold or scrapped during the wartime retooling. The shotgun line had been similarly broken up. The company that had earned millions in 1917 and 1918 had no civilian production capacity to fall back on when the military demand evaporated. The workforce was dismissed. Within 6 months of the armistice, the New Haven payroll had dropped from nearly 3,000 to fewer than 400. The men who had earned wartime wages went back to peacetime trades or onto the unemployment lines. The corporation's stock price collapsed through 1919 and 1920. The syndicate that had organized the acquisition began looking for ways to extract its remaining value from the company before the inevitable bankruptcy proceedings began. By 1921, the Marlin Rockwell Corporation was effectively insolvent. The corporation continued producing a reduced line of sporting rifles and shotguns through 1921 and 1922, drawing down the inventory of raw materials and finished components that had accumulated in the warehouses, but the operation was generating losses every month. The lever-action rifles being produced were essentially the same designs Hepburn had completed before his death in 1914, and the market for those rifles had not grown during the war years while Winchester and Remington had developed competing products. Marlin had no money for new tooling. Marlin had no designer of Hepburn's caliber on staff. Marlin had a name, a depleted factory, and a balance sheet that would no longer support continued operations. In the spring of 1923, the corporation filed for bankruptcy protection. The court appointed a receiver to manage the operation while creditors sorted out their claims against the remaining assets. Production continued at a minimal level through 1923 and into 1924, mostly to fulfill outstanding orders and to demonstrate to the court that the company was a going concern that could be sold to a competent buyer. The receiver advertised the assets for sale in the trade press throughout 1924. There were no serious offers for over a year. The firearms industry was in a post-war depression of its own, and no established manufacturer wanted to acquire a competitor with depleted tooling and an aging product line at any price the bankruptcy court considered acceptable. The man who bought the Marlin Firearms Company at the bankruptcy auction in 1924 was not a gunmaker. He was a New Haven attorney named Frank Kenna, 43 years old, with limited capital and no experience in firearms manufacturing. Kenna had handled legal work for several of the corporation's creditors during the receivership and had spent 2 years walking through the empty factory, reviewing the inventories, and talking to the few remaining workmen. He concluded that the company could be revived by anyone willing to operate it conservatively and without expectations of immediate profit. He bid $100 at the auction. No one bid against him. The check he wrote to the bankruptcy court nearly bounced. He covered it the following week with a loan from a New Haven bank against the security of the factory's machinery. Kenna assumed several $100,000 in liabilities along with the assets. The auction transferred the corporate shell, the factory building, the remaining machinery, the unsold inventory, the patent portfolio, and the Marlin name. It also transferred the debts owed to suppliers, the unpaid back wages owed to workmen the receivership had been unable to pay, the property taxes due to the city of New Haven, and the unpaid utility bills that had accumulated through the bankruptcy proceedings. Kenna spent his first year as the company's owner negotiating settlements with creditors. He paid what he could from the operating revenue of the reduced production line, deferred what could be deferred, and got most of the remaining creditors to accept fractional payments in exchange for releases of their claims. The first task was to keep the doors open. Kenna restored a portion of the pre-war product line, focusing on the lever-action rifles and the shotguns that still had brand recognition in the dealer network. He hired back a handful of the pre-war workmen who had stayed in New Haven through the receivership years, men who knew the machinery and the assembly procedures from direct experience. Production through 1925 and 1926 was at perhaps a tenth of the pre-war peak, but the rifles being produced were selling, and the operation was breaking even by 1927. Then the stock market collapsed in October of 1929, and the firearms industry collapsed with it. Civilian discretionary spending evaporated through 1930 and 1931. Sporting goods dealers stopped placing orders. The men who would have bought a new Marlin lever action in 1929 to take deer in the New England woods kept their old rifles and put the money toward food and rent. The wholesale orders that had been carrying the company through its post-war recovery stopped arriving. By the spring of 1932, the operation was producing rifles at a fraction of even its reduced 1925 levels, and the inventory in the warehouse was growing faster than the dealers could sell it. Kenna had two choices. He could close the factory, fire the workmen, and try to sell whatever assets the receivership of 1923 had not already stripped from the building. Or he could find something else for the factory to produce, something the country would still buy in the depths of the worst economic collapse in American history. Picture this: Frank Kenna, in the spring of 1932, walking the second floor of the State Street factory on a Tuesday morning in March. Half the milling machines stand cold and silent under canvas covers. The line shafts overhead are not turning. The men who would normally be at those benches have been laid off, sent home with 2 weeks' wages and an indefinite suspension notice. On the other half of the floor, machinery that was originally installed to mill receiver blanks for the Model 1893 lever action has been retooled to stamp razor blades. The blades are double-edged carbon steel, ground, and hardened to the patterns Kenna licensed from a Pittsburgh inventor the previous winter. They sell for 50 cents a hundred at drugstores across New England. The men working that side of the floor are former Marlin armorers who learned to file rifle locks in the 1890s and who are now stamping shaving steel because shaving steel is what the country can still afford to buy. Here's the thing about Marlin's survival in the 1930s. The company that armed the American frontier survived the Great Depression by selling razor blades. The Marlin Razor Blade Company was incorporated as a subsidiary in 1932, manufactured its products on the same factory floor as the rifles, and, within 2 years, was selling more by dollar volume than the firearms division. Kenna added handcuff production in 1933, licensing patterns from a Massachusetts manufacturer whose business had failed in the early Depression years. Marlin handcuffs were sold to municipal police departments and county sheriffs across the United States through the 1930s and into the 1940s. The handcuffs were profitable. The razor blades were profitable. The rifles in those years were not, but the rifles kept being produced in small quantities by the older workmen Kenna had refused to lay off, because Kenna believed that when the country recovered, the rifles would be what brought the company back. The decision was not sentimental, it was strategic. Kenna understood what the Marlin brothers had not. Razor blades and handcuffs would carry the operation through the bad years, but they would never build the company into anything larger than a New Haven specialty manufacturer. The rifles were the product that mattered. The rifles were the asset that had value if the company ever found itself in a position to expand again. The rifles required workmen who knew how to build them, and once those workmen were dispersed, they could not be reassembled. Kenna kept the rifle line operating at a deliberate loss through the worst years of the Depression because keeping it operating preserved the institutional knowledge that the next generation of designs would require. The design work began in earnest in the late 1930s. Kenna's son, Frank Kenna Jr., had finished his engineering studies at Yale and joined the company in 1936. The younger Kenna was put in charge of the rifle development program, with a mandate to produce a successor to the Model 1893 and Model 1895 lever actions that would be ready when the civilian market recovered. The program proceeded slowly through 1937 and 1938. The new rifle, designated internally as the Model 1893G and later renamed the Model 336, would use a refined version of the side eject action with a round bolt rather than the square bolt of the earlier Marlin designs. The round bolt was easier to machine on modern equipment, stronger under the pressures of smokeless powder cartridges, and smoother in operation than the older square bolt design. The development work was complete by 1939. Production tooling was being assembled in 1940. Then the European War broke out, and the timeline changed again. Marlin received contracts for the United Defense M42 submachine gun and for barrels and components feeding the Springfield M1903, the Browning series, and several aircraft machine gun programs. The wartime production was significant, but Kenna deliberately limited the company's exposure to contracts that could be canceled at the armistice. The lessons of 1918 had not been forgotten. Here's the thing about how the Model 336 survived the war years. While the front of the factory ran military contracts on 3 shifts, the old armorers from the Depression rifle line kept the development tooling in motion at the back of the building, 2 and 3 men at a bench, fitting prototype receivers by hand. The program never stopped. By 1945, when the contracts ended on the day the war did, the Model 336 was ready. The factory had not been completely retooled for military production. The workforce still knew how to build sporting rifles. The rifle that would define the next 40 years of the company was waiting on the assembly bench for the post-war market to open. The Model 336 was introduced to the American market in 1948. It was the rifle the company had been developing through the back half of the Depression and the war years, and it arrived in stores at the moment the American hunting market was beginning the largest expansion in its history. Returning veterans had cash from wartime savings. The post-war suburbs were filling with men who had grown up in rural communities, and who took their sons hunting in the autumn the way their fathers had taken them. The lever-action deer rifle was the standard tool of the American whitetail hunter, and the question every man buying his first serious rifle in 1948 had to answer was whether he wanted a Winchester Model 94 or a Marlin Model 336. The Model 336 was the technical and commercial peak of everything Marlin had built since Hepburn arrived in 1888. It used the side eject action that had been the company's signature for 60 years, refined and modernized with the round bolt design that the pre-war development program had completed. It was chambered for the .30-30 Winchester cartridge that defined the American deer hunting market, with additional variants in .35 Remington, .32 Winchester Special, and a handful of more specialized rounds. It accepted scope mounts directly on top of the solid receiver, a feature the Winchester Model 94 could not match without aftermarket modification. It cost slightly less than the Winchester at retail. It was, on every technical specification a buyer could compare, the better rifle. The market noticed. The Model 336 outsold the Winchester Model 94 in certain years through the 1950s, particularly in regions where buyers cared about scope mounting. The Northeast and the Upper Midwest, where deer were taken at moderate ranges through wooded country and where many hunters used low-powered scopes, became Marlin strongholds. Winchester retained the Deep South and the open country of the western states, where iron sights remained dominant, and the Winchester brand carried cultural weight that no technical comparison would dislodge. But the Model 336 had succeeded in doing what no previous Marlin lever action had managed. It had pulled the company even with Winchester in the most important segment of the American sporting rifle market. The Model 39A followed in 1954. It was the second great rifle of the company's post-war era, a refinement of the takedown lever action in .22 long rifle that the company had been producing under various model designations since 1897. The 39A was not a high-volume rifle in the way the 336 was. It was a specialist's rifle, expensive for a rimfire, built to a standard of fit and finish that no other manufacturer attempted in the .22 market. It became the rifle that fathers bought for their sons to learn shooting with, the rifle that small-bore competitive shooters used in indoor leagues, the rifle that small-game hunters carried for squirrels and rabbits in the New England woods. The 39A remained in continuous production from 1954 until 2007, 53 years without interruption, making it the longest continuously produced shoulder firearm in American history. Picture this: the North Haven factory in 1965. The new plant Marlin had built in 1959 to consolidate operations under one roof. 600 workmen on 2 floors. The morning shift starts at 7. The smell of cutting oil and gun bluing hangs over the machine floor. The same smell the State Street factory had carried in the 1920s, the same smell the Willow Street factory had carried in the 1890s. The Model 336 assembly line runs along the east wall, where receivers come off the milling machines in a steady rhythm, move through the heat treatment furnaces glowing dull orange behind their steel shields, get polished and blued in the finishing department, and are fitted to walnut stocks at long oak benches scarred by 60 years of use. The Model 39. A-line runs along the west wall in a different rhythm, slower, quieter, where the takedown rifles require additional hand fitting at the receiver joint, and where the older workmen with 30 and 40 years of company experience perform the final adjustments with files and stones, the way their fathers had taught them. Some of those workmen are sons of men who worked at the State Street factory in the 1920s. A few are grandsons of men who fitted Marlin rifles when Hepburn was still alive. The company had become a multi-generational institution in New Haven, and the workmen who built its rifles understood themselves as continuing a tradition rather than holding a job. Frank Kenna died in 1949, the year after the Model 336 reached the market. His son, Frank Kenna Jr., took over as president and ran the company through the post-war boom years. The younger Kenna had been managing the rifle development program since 1936 and had been the operational head of the firearms division throughout the war years. The transition was smooth and unremarked. The company continued to produce rifles, expand its product line, retain its workforce, and pay modest but consistent dividends to the family shareholders. In 1969, Frank Kenna Jr. transferred operational responsibility to his son, Frank Kenna III, who became the third generation of the family to run the company his great-uncle's law practice had acquired at a bankruptcy auction in 1924. The catalog widened through the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s without losing its center. Heavier cartridges arrived with the Model 444 in 1965 and the reintroduced Model 1895 in .45-70 in 1972, putting Marlin lever actions into the hands of Alaskan brown bear guides, Yukon outfitters, and Northwest Territories sheep hunters who needed rifles that worked in temperatures no semi-automatic could tolerate. The acquisition of Harrington and Richardson Firearms in 2000 extended the line into single-shot rifles and break-action shotguns through the H&R 1871 subsidiary. 3 product families, 1 factory, 1 family running it. Here's the thing about the Kenna stewardship. The family had run the company for over 80 years by the end of the 20th century, 3 generations. Frank Kenna had bought the bankrupt corporation in 1924, his son had taken over in 1949, his grandson had assumed command in 1969, and was still running operations as the century closed. The company had remained in family hands through the Depression, through the Second World War, through the post-war boom, through the consolidation of the American firearms industry in the 1970s and 1980s when Remington had been acquired by DuPont and Winchester had been acquired by the Olin Corporation and then by U.S. Repeating Arms. Marlin had stayed independent. Marlin had stayed in New Haven. Marlin had stayed Marlin. The factory in North Haven ran on the same patterns the family had established in the post-war years. The workforce stabilized around 650 men through the 1980s, climbed slightly through the early 1990s as Asian export markets opened, and held at roughly 700 through the back half of the decade. The product line was wider than at any point in the company's history. The catalog ran to dozens of variants of the core lever-action models, plus the H&R single shots, the bolt-action rimfires, the shotgun line, and a series of specialty rifles produced in small batches for the collector market. The company was profitable. The company was technically respected. The company was, by the standards of the consolidating American firearms industry, an anomaly. By the late 1990s, the anomaly was becoming visible to investors who specialized in identifying companies that had remained in family hands longer than market conditions would normally support. The American firearms industry was consolidating around 3 centers of capital, with Remington under DuPont's successor entities, Winchester under Olin, and then under the Browning subsidiary of Fabrique Nationale, and the smaller manufacturers being absorbed into holding companies that pursued cost reduction through shared procurement and combined administration. Marlin was the obvious next target. The Kenna family owned all the voting shares. The 3rd generation was approaching retirement age. The 4th generation had limited interest in continuing the family business. The conditions for a sale were assembling themselves. In the autumn of 2007, the Cerberus Capital Management Private Equity Fund had already absorbed Remington, Bushmaster, DPMS, and several smaller firearms manufacturers into a holding company called the Freedom Group. The strategy was straightforward. Acquire the major American firearms brands, consolidate manufacturing under shared facilities, reduce headcount, eliminate duplicate administration, and exit at a multiple of the consolidated earnings within 5 to 7 years. The Kenna family's controlling interest in Marlin Firearms was the next obvious acquisition. The negotiations were brief. The price was $47 million. The deal closed before the end of the year. The Freedom Group operated Marlin as a wholly owned subsidiary through 2008 and 2009 while the integration plan was developed. The plan was announced in January of 2010. The North Haven plant would be closed. Production of all Marlin rifles would be transferred to the existing Remington facilities in Ilion, New York, and Mayfield, Kentucky. 265 workmen would be terminated. The closure would be completed by the end of the year. The reaction in New Haven was disbelief. The North Haven factory had been operating continuously since 1959. Some of the workmen on the line in 2010 had been hired in the 1970s and had worked there for more than 30 years. A few were second-generation Marlin employees whose fathers had worked at the State Street plant before the 1959 relocation. The notification of termination was delivered in stages through the spring and summer, with the older workers receiving severance packages that reflected their seniority, and the younger workers receiving the legal minimum required by Connecticut law. The men were given the option of relocating to Ilion or Mayfield to continue working for Remington at the new production sites. Most declined. The dispersal was the moment the institution died. The Marlin gunsmiths who refused to relocate took with them the operational knowledge that the company had accumulated over 6 decades of post-war production. How the side eject geometry actually had to be milled to produce a smooth action. How the receivers should be heat-treated to hold dimensional stability under the pressures of Magnum cartridges. Which tolerances mattered for which components and which could be relaxed without affecting function. How to fit a 39A takedown joint so that the rifle held 0 between disassemblies. This knowledge was not in the manufacturing documentation. It was in the heads of men who had been doing the work for 30 years. And when those men walked out the door of the North Haven plant for the last time in December of 2010, the knowledge walked out with them. The Ilion and Mayfield facilities received the machinery and the documentation. They did not receive the men. The Remington workforce that took over Marlin production knew Remington products. They did not know Marlin products. The differences were not obvious from blueprints alone. By 2011, the rifles coming off the Remington production lines were exhibiting quality problems that no Marlin had exhibited in a generation. Sights that did not align with the bore. Actions that were rough enough that the lever required force to operate. Stocks that did not fit the receivers correctly. Finishes that flaked off within months of purchase. The community of American gun owners has institutional memory that no marketing campaign can override. The rifles produced at the Remington facilities became known among collectors and dealers as Remlins, a portmanteau that carried more contempt than any single word in the firearms vocabulary at that time. The forums and review sites filled with photographs of misaligned sights and roughly machined receivers. The dealers stopped stocking new Marlins because the returns were too high. The reputation that the Kenna family had built over 83 years and that John Malin Marlin had founded 140 years earlier collapsed in roughly 36 months. Picture this. A factory that produced rifles continuously from 1959 to 2010, run by men who understood the products they were building, replaced by a factory run by men who did not. The machinery was the same. The drawings were the same. The cartridges and the patterns and the specifications were the same. The men were different. Everything else followed from that. In September of 2020, at the bankruptcy auction of Remington Outdoor Company, the Marlin brand and intellectual property were purchased by Sturm, Ruger and Company for $28,300,000. The North Haven plant was not part of the sale. The plant had been sold off years earlier as surplus real estate. Ruger took the patents, the drawings, the brand names, the trademarks, and the inventory of components that had not yet been assembled into finished rifles. The acquisition price was a fraction of what the Freedom Group had paid for the same assets in 2007, and a smaller fraction still of what the Kenna family would have received if they had refused to sell in the first place, Ruger began producing Marlin rifles at its plant in Mayodan, North Carolina, in late 2021. The first rifles to come off the Ruger production line were Model 1895 lever actions in .45-70 Government, the heavy big game rifles that had the simplest manufacturing requirements and the most patient customer base. The quality recovered immediately. The Mayodan production lines used modern CNC machining and a workforce that had been trained on firearms manufacturing for over 70 years of Ruger Company history. The new Marlins were as well made as anything the Mayodan plant produced. They were, by every objective measurement of fit, finish, and function, equal or superior to the rifles the North Haven plant had been producing before the Cerberus acquisition. But the company that had made the original rifles was gone. Ruger had bought the brand. The institution that the brand had represented, the multi-generational workforce in New Haven, the design tradition that ran from Hepburn through 3 generations of the Kenna family, the workmen who knew how a Marlin should feel in the hand when the lever was worked, none of that was transferable in a bankruptcy auction. The new Marlins were good rifles. They were not the same rifles. The North Haven site today carries the marks of what it was and what it became. The 1959 factory building still stands at the corner of Kenna Drive and Universal Drive, the street name preserved from the years when the Kenna family ran the company that ran the city's largest single industrial employer. The building has been partially redeveloped for warehouse and light industrial use. The original main entrance, the loading docks where the finished rifles were shipped to dealers across the United States. The parking lot where 600 workmen parked their cars from 1959 to 2010 all remain visible to anyone who drives past. The brick walls are stained with decades of weather. The signage has been replaced with the names of the tenants now occupying the space. The Marlin name does not appear anywhere on the building. Open the gun safe of any American hunter over 50, and you will still find one rifle that nobody is making anymore the way it used to be made. A Marlin lever action with the Kenna-era serial numbers stamped on the receiver, with the bluing thinned at the muzzle from 40 years of carrying, with the walnut darkened by handling, with the side ejection port that L.L. Hepburn drew at his desk in 1888, and that the workmen of New Haven cut into solid receiver blanks for 122 years. The rifle works. The rifle will work for another century if it is cared for. The company that made it does not. The object outlasted the institution that produced it. The rivers in Connecticut still run past the old factory sites. The brick walls still stand. The rifles are still in the safes.